one of the things that makes parenting really hard is it's something you can't learn from anyone else.
Right.
Because the sample size is just one. Children are not just shrunken adults. They are beings in themselves, right?
That's right.
Adults tend to treat children with a lot of love. But do we respect the mind of a child? Do we try to understand that? My son, when he was in middle school, when he was diagnosed with dysgraphia, he had a challenge with writing. It came to a point where he once came back and told me, Baba, I'm just an average person. I was in all sorts of emotions. I'm guilty that I didn't take strong action on it. His teacher was incredibly supportive, and he actually ended up publishing a story. I think the first thing that children of our country need is a belief in their potential. Because every child is destined to do something really, really good. That belief is first and foremost very important. Having conversations with fathers. Mothers make a huge, huge impact. We as fathers, I think, need to make a bigger impact.
And all the good things, right, that is worth something will not happen overnight.
It's all not
It takes a long time.
It takes a long time.
Anustup, welcome to DadSense.
So excited. I can't believe we are doing this.
I know. We've been talking about it forever now. And I know you're a busy guy and you've been on the road for a long time, but I've been really greedy to get you on this conversation for many reasons, which we'll talk about. One of them is, of course, you being a dad and us going back all these 25 years. It's another opportunity for us to hang out, but for a cause now.
No, and I've been looking forward to it ever since I heard that you are trying podcasting, and of course connecting after almost 25 years, since we were both young people, I think, at the cusp of adulthood, I would say.
Yes, exactly.
And doing things I don't think we should let people on the podcast know.
Well, you never know. We can go there too. Absolutely. It's fascinating how life comes full circle. You and I met in 1989 in BJP College, Bhubaneswar, and look where we are. And I know we had a chance to spend some time a couple of weeks back walking by the lake, which is not what we would have imagined back in '89, taking a walk for our health and having a nice breakfast. But I'm glad we are here, and I'm really excited about this conversation.
Look forward, Subasis.
Yeah. So let's just start by me taking you to your childhood. I love starting my conversation there. There's so much power to our childhood. We sometimes forget how much it shapes, influences all of us as adults. I know we met when we were sort of in between childhood and adulthood, but let's go a little bit back further in the past. Talk to me about your childhood. What are some of your favorite childhood memories? Where did you grow up, and how was life with dad and mom like?
Oh, I'm glad you mentioned my childhood, and I think as I look back, I was very, very fortunate, and I guess I am more grateful for my childhood than I was then, or grateful to my parents. And since we're having this conversation about parenting, I'm amazed how much my parents invested in me and in themselves as parents. And I'm reminded of my father, who unfortunately passed away a few years after I left junior college. Sometime I was in college, and I think he left an indelible impression on me. And many years later, when I was still a graduate student in the US, I had carried a lot of stuff from India, and I discovered a bunch of letters that he had written to me during the time I was in college, because that's the time I was far away.
So that was in REC Rourkela?
Yes, when I was studying in engineering. My father used to write me letters.
Were those inland letters?
Inland letters, and I used to get these letters every other week.
What would he write in those letters?
I think a lot of those letters were about conversations, and they were really unlike a letter that a parent would write to a child, but it was more like two friends writing to each other. And I remember him talking about being a learner himself. And I think that's, I remember one of the letters he wrote to me was he attended a lecture. I remember it was called the Gopinath Mohanty Memorial Lecture. Gopinath Mohanty is a very famous
Sure.
a novelist, as you know,
Absolutely.
in Odisha.
In Odisha,
Happened
yeah.
to be also related to us, to my mother. And he attended this lecture where he spoke about attending this conversation with I think, Anantamurthy, who was a Kannada novelist, and he said, I really enjoyed the lecture, and I hope sometime that you go to a university abroad and attend lectures like this, which broadens your mind. Oftentimes, I do remember him writing letters to me. I didn't do particularly well in engineering. I think right after we met, I think I was doing somewhat well in junior college, but then after that, I really started not enjoying my college, and my parents were rightfully concerned that I wasn't really applying myself. But when I read his letters much later,
Did you read those letters at the time
I
when you
did.
received them fairly seriously, or you kind of appreciated
I appreciated them much
much
later,
later? Yeah.
much later.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things he had talked about is he was more empathetic to my not doing well at that point of time, and being more encouraging to find things for myself which interested me more, which I think was extraordinary at that point of time, because the archetype of the parent then was, and I guess now is, parents just want children to be just like them, and he was a very successful engineer, very well respected. But one of the things he did allow me to do was to pursue my own thing. So I ended up actually pursuing something very, very different after engineering, doing public policy and then education. And I would think that had he not encouraged me, I would not have done things which I did ended up doing. But going back into my childhood, I think a couple of memories do stand out. One was I think my parents, I'd like to say, carried out all kinds of experiments in education on me. So
were you the only child?
I was the only child, yes. I
Right,
was the only
right,
child.
yeah.
And that sometimes made it harder in some ways and easier in some other ways.
But they had you to experiment everything with.
So I started off at a school which was very progressive, run by the Aurobindo Ashram folks in Bhubaneswar in Odisha. And the school was incredibly unusual in the sense that they didn't have that much focus on examinations. Children were allowed to just be themselves, and it was a little bit sometimes too much. I ended up spending my entire time in the art class and doing whatever I wanted to do.
I didn't know that.
And then my parents moved to Algeria, to North Africa, where my father was on deputation to the Algerian government, and my mother was working on her PhD. And I think those 2 years were incredible. I was homeschooled for 2 years.
And what stage of life?
This was, I think I was about between 6 to 8 years old, or thereabout.
Still pretty formative. Yeah?
Very formative. And I didn't go to school, and some of it was just happenstance, because when we were in a small town in Algeria, there wasn't, most of the schools taught French and Arabic, and if I had to go to any school that taught in English, which actually I didn't know that well by then, I had to go far away and go to a boarding school abroad in Europe or somewhere, which my parents felt was not worth the while. So they ended up taking 30 kilograms of books with them. So I remember my mother going and just cleaning out the bookstore in Bhubaneswar. At that point of time, Subhashish, you came to Bhubaneswar maybe a little bit later.
Yes.
But there were just 2 bookstores. And
I mean, when I got there weren't far too many more.
Yeah, so my mother basically bought a whole lot of books, and those 2 years I just spent, and my mother was writing her PhD, she was at home. So I just read a whole bunch of books and learned a couple of languages, including my own. Even Odia, I did not know how to write. Of course, I knew how to speak. So those 2 years were very formative, because I had this opportunity to explore and experience on my own. And come to think of it, it was just so incredible that my
Oh my
parents
God.
let me do that. And by the time I came back, I was a complete misfit. We came back to India.
Where did you go move back to?
Odisha, back to Odisha,
Back to Bhubaneswar.
Odisha, back to Bhubaneswar, because my parents still were in their government jobs. They went back to their jobs.
So your mom used to work as well?
Yeah, if you remember, my mom was a professor in
Oh,
the
yeah,
same
correct.
college,
Yes,
right?
yes,
She
yes.
was an anthropology professor. She went back to teaching, and my father went back to his government job. And I had come back from this homeschooling experience, was back in school.
Did you
Absolutely.
go back to the same school or you went
I
to a
did
different
go back to the same school, but
the Aurobindo school.
but I did not fit in at all, because my day was, even though the school was very welcoming to all my idiosyncrasies, I still didn't fit in, right?
It stretched even their sort of framework.
And then my parents thought that I was becoming too detached from mainstream schooling, mainstream education, and they thought I should go to a regular government school like all other children. So off I went to a Odia medium government school called Unit 1 Boys High School.
Of course.
The school didn't have a name. It
Right,
was
I know.
based on the neighborhood it was in. I think that was a very interesting experience, because I really came face to face with what education was really like for most children. And I think I did come from a relatively privileged background, in the sense that my parents had provided me all these things before I got to a certain age. But there I was in grade 6 or 7, and I came face to face with what the mainstream education system was like, what rote learning was like, what it meant to be studying only from your textbooks and only for your examinations, so on and so forth. But yeah, to cut a long story short, I think the memories I have of my childhood are of parents who took a lot of interest in me as a person. I think that has stayed with me for a very, very long time. And I often feel very inadequate as a parent, now that I'm a parent, to see how fortunate I was to have the parents. Of course, I didn't feel that way when I was a child, and I
know,
rebelled.
we all do,
And so yeah, that was it. But thanks for taking me back to that.
Of course,
those days.
Well, I didn't know about this little aspect of your childhood growing up in first going to the Aurobindo school, and then of course I knew about you moving to Africa, but I didn't exactly know that you were homeschooled. But there's so many. I have so many questions about that phase. So we all know now that having lived in different parts of the world, how much your horizon just gets expanded, right? When you meet people from different backgrounds and cultures, and at that stage of your life, do you think whatever followed in your life, those couple of years in Algeria had that shaped who you were becoming? I know you didn't really think about it that way at the time, but now if you were to go back and, like you said, you came back to Bhubaneswar, but you were a kind of a changed human being, changed boy.
Yeah, changed boy. And no, when I think of it, it was an incredibly liberating experience. And if you think of the 80s back then, and we were in Odisha, I hadn't seen many things. So for example, television, right? For the first time, I saw television in my home. Right, you could have movies beamed to you at your home. Right? That's incredible. Then, in the 1980s, if you remember, India was part of the non-aligned movement.
Correct.
Slightly leaning towards the Soviet bloc.
That's right.
And so these countries looked up to India, and India provided many professionals. So in Algeria and in many parts of North Africa then, there were lots of Indian professionals, doctors and engineers, but there were also professionals from other countries. So we had close friends from Russia, from Palestine, who had come, and they were very qualified. And most of our friends, family friends, were engineers or doctors who were helping build the community there,
building
right?
the nation, yes.
So that was an interesting exposure to people. But it
Fascinating.
was also an exposure to finding humanity in people who are very different from your own. I think when I was growing up in Odisha, I think most people were really like ourselves, right? They shared our language, they shared our religion, ethos. So I think living with people who are very different from yours,
Yes.
who's so one of the things I remember is just what people eat, or how they celebrate their festivals, and the fact that you don't speak their own language, but people are very, very welcoming. So I think one of the things I remember is I lost both my grandparents during that time, and we heard, and it took a long time even for that news to come to us, right? Because you didn't have even phones that time. I think somebody sent a telegram. And I remember that our entire community, our neighbors, our Arab neighbors, our French neighbors, they came to mourn with us, with my parents. And I think that left an impression. I think that left, in some ways, an earning uh, to to treat people other than yourself as your own. I also realized there was so much to learn and so much to see. And so during that time, my parents had a little bit of saving, because they obviously made a lot more than what they would make as government employees in India. And I remember having a conversation with them. They said, "Look, we have some savings. How do you want us to spend it?" And here are parents who are asking a 6-7-year-old child.
So they asked you?
Yeah, they asked me. So they gave me a choice.
That's
they said,
so cute.
So I still remember, they said that, if we go back, we can probably get a good car or a good house. I mean, we had built a house, but we'll have a better life than we had when you went back. Or we could spend all of this traveling. What do you want? So so we collectively decided that we'll spend this money traveling. So they said, "Okay, you organize the trip." So I actually went with my dad and got these maps and all of that, and we planned this trip to Europe. And so I think that was an opportunity for me to think about, I guess, what's more valuable in life, right? I think obviously at that point of time, money was really important. You hadn't seen that much, even basic things, right? We didn't have a car when we were in India. Like I said, we didn't have a television. We didn't have a lot of things, but it also got me to think about what's important. So when you think about opening yourself to different cultures and traveling to different places, those seem to be things that are more important. So those things struck out.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm struck by this just in the last 5-10 minutes of conversation is how I'm picturing your dad and mom and dad connecting with you. One thing that's striking out to me is how he was treating you beyond the age that you were in. I mean, in the, like you said, in traditional archetype of parents, it's always like a top-down, communication style, right? Like I'm going to tell you what you should be doing, or it's a lot of instructive sort of communication. But in this case, like even before the letters, where you said it was more like coming from a friend, even this idea that your dad and mom are asking, hey, like, what do you want to do with this money, is not a very common conversation, at least in my own imagination of, being from the same state, Odia families, back in the day, having this sort of a conversation was very common, and that's really fascinating.
Yeah, and I would learn it much later, when I learned education formally, and I learned about child development. And I had a professor named Eleanor Duckworth, she was a professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And she was...
She's not connected with Angela Duckworth, right?
She's not another Duckworth, not Angela Duckworth. She's
Right.
Eleanor Duckworth.
Got it.
She is a Canadian-American professor, perhaps now in her late 80s.
Yep.
And She has written a very interesting book called The Having of Wonderful Ideas. And she was Piaget's translator. Piaget, the famous Swiss psychologist
Yes.
who's talked a lot about child development. And one of the things that Eleanor taught us was that children are not just shrunken adults, they are beings in themselves, right?
That's right.
So every child, whatever stage of development they are in, they are full human
They're just
beings.
being, yeah.
They are beings. I think there's our society has a lot of love for children, right? We treat children with a lot of affection. Most people do, of course. Some don't, and that's cause for concern. But there is this
When you
element.
say our society, you mean in India, yeah?
In general now, I think whether it's in India or in general societies,
Universally,
children, universally children, adults tend to treat children with a lot of love, right? Affection. But do we treat children with respect?
That is correct.
Which means that do we respect the mind of a child? Do we try to understand that? I think these two connected much later in my head.
Right,
That-
but I think in some shape, it was already, you were already experiencing that, being treated with respect by your dad and mom, right? Unbeknownst to you, which must have been shaping who you were becoming, and that's what's striking to me. And I think Eleanor Duckworth's idea that children are beings in whatever stage of their lives is a powerful idea, and I don't think all of us in the world in general and India in particular, we skew so much towards love. We don't pay that much attention to the respect part, right?
Yeah, and I'll bring up a funny incident we probably remember. Not to put you on this spot, I think we had teachers who took great pleasure in throwing us out of
Kicking us
classes.
out of the class, yes.
I think one teacher I remember particularly threw you out of the class because you were wearing a colorful T-shirt.
That's
I
right.
think that's one of the
Yeah.
interesting memories
Correct.
of our junior college, and a lot of times. It's not that teachers don't treat children with respect. It's just that there's often this understanding that the job is to make this person, just to fix this person, right?
Yes.
And
Whether it's parents or teachers, right?
or all of us, and we do have that. I do experience that part in myself, to be completely honest, right?
Sure.
But there is also this opportunity for all of us to really understand where this child or young person is. And I'll give you an experience. When I first went to the US, I went from engineering, and you also went to engineering, and most of the time it's not an easy relationship between the teachers and the students, right? It's actually quite an uneasy relationship.
Quite a hostile one.
Quite a hostile one. And I went to the US to study public policy, and one of the courses I was taking was on ethics in the public professions, and this was a course on philosophy and ethics, and I absolutely had no idea about it. And the professor, I remember this elderly gentleman named Stan Carpenter, he put me on the spot. He said, "Anustup, what do you think?" And it struck me that no one has ever asked me this question ever. What do I think? But I was so trained in my head not to think for myself. I was almost telling myself that, no, I'm not supposed to think. You are the one who's supposed to think and tell me. And I'm supposed to take notes and write in the examination. But to think for myself is a thing which I learned at home because of my parents, but something I missed in school and college. And I learned that much later.
Yeah.
And to creating opportunities, and now as an educator, as a parent, I think, how do I create more opportunities for children, both in my home and the children I am responsible for as an educator broadly? How do I create more opportunities for them to think on their own? I think is a very, very big challenge.
Yeah. No, absolutely, and we'll go to those spaces in our during our conversation. But now, let's cut to you becoming a parent. we'll just bounce back and forth between your role as an educator and your role as a dad and a parent. How has that? Just talk to me about your, parenting journey, about your children, and how have your growth, your childhood, and your education shaped who you became as a dad. And I know it's work in progress. We're still work in progress as parents. But how did that set you up on that journey?
I think parenting fundamentally changes everyone.
Yes.
And it's so hard. In fact, I must admit that one of the reasons this podcast has taken so long to fruition is that I was actually scared of having this conversation. Like the first time when I met you for coffee, I think
Yeah, maybe a couple of years back.
no, it's more than a couple of years, more than that. And you said you were running this podcast on parenting and you'd like to have me, and you were so excited about it. I was feeling like an imposter, that I said that I have no right to go on this podcast because I am constantly failing every day. I'm constantly struggling. I have two beautiful young children. Advait, who is now 16, on the cusp of getting into college. Srishti is 14, is in high school right now.
Yeah.
And every day I am struggling, failing, including this morning, and learning on my own. So,
Well, first of all, thanks for being vulnerable and sharing that, because that's a huge. It's not easy to share that, so I appreciate you sharing that honestly, and I agree with you. I mean, it's a big weight on you when somebody asks you to talk about parenting, because you're always questioning yourself, right?
yeah, and one of the things that makes parenting really hard is it's something you can't learn from anyone else,
Right.
because the sample size is just one. Because you're doing it for the first time,
Right.
and you're doing it for your child the very first time, and that makes it really hard to apply anything that you've learned in the past, and because the stakes are also very high,
Right.
it's much harder not to regress to your lower self, right?
Yes.
I often get this, and I get very harsh feedback from everyone at home. Like my parents, my mom tells me you're not doing the right job, and my children tell me, you always talk about studies because you're an educator. You're trying to experiment all these education things on us, or you just don't understand what we are doing. So oftentimes you're really unsure whether you are getting ahead. And the other problem with parenting is that whatever you do, you don't see the impact of it until years or perhaps much later, and sometimes you might not be around to see the impact.
True.
Right? So the time frame in which I see the success. But
So
I'll
you
tell
tell
you,
me, you were on the fence of.
yeah, I'm on the fence. And, I'll tell you a couple of things that I've learned from my children, and because they are the best teachers, because they're constantly testing you, right? I mean, my son Advait, he's, I have learned a lot about how to be a good human being from him.
How so?
And he's incredibly thoughtful about other people, and someone who really understands other people really well. I remember when he was a really small kid. He was maybe 4 or 5. I don't remember how old he was. Certainly not someone who, when I would come home, he would say, maybe you are tired. You look really tired. Do you need anything to settle down? And he really likes.
So he'll notice that.
He'll notice that, and he really likes young kids, like kids younger than himself, and they gravitate to him. He takes interest in them, and he once told us.
So he has kind of this nurturing
instincts, and he would also. He once told us, "What do you want to do when you're growing up?" He said, "I want to be a boy babysitter." because
cute.
so that's something I learned from him, and I think what I learned from Srushti is that how do you just learn to be yourself and not to conform to things that the rest of the world wants you to be, right?
Yeah.
Being a younger child, being a girl.
How did you learn that? What does she do that?
Yeah, I think a couple of things, right? She's incredibly irreverent, so gets into all sorts of trouble with everyone.
She's the younger one, yeah?
She's the younger one,
Yeah.
and has very strong convictions. She is incredibly passionate about gymnastics, to
You
the
mentioned,
extent, yeah, and that just drives her life, and she will just try to remove every obstacle in her way to get to her gymnastics class, and this kind of obsessive compulsive drive to get to where you want, I think that's incredibly something she teaches me. So
It's fascinating you say that because my younger one is my daughter too, and there's such a strong, uncanny resemblance in her behavior. I mean, other than the fact that they're girls and the second ones, she shows the same streaks, same traits. Like I know she's acting in a drama in her school, and like you know how it like pick up kids and dropping them off. You're managing the logistics of kids every week. But she makes sure that her class, her drama rehearsals, do not get disrupted, no matter what. She'll guilt you, she'll shame you, but she makes sure that her rehearsal happens I mean, she's there for her rehearsals every weekend. She has that sense of persistence to accomplish in a very slow, unthreatening, unaggressive ways, but she gets her stuff done. That's fascinating you share that.
yeah, and I think it resonates. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, you were in a unique place as at home. I can't imagine, like, one of the things that your kids are accusing you of experimenting all that you're doing on your day job on them. But I'm also curious about that. How do you take off your hat of having been in this space, having built a career, having studied this? How do you approach parenting from that standpoint, being an educator, knowing what works for children and seeing, your kids growing up? How do you bring that to life? And what are your struggles, actually?
Well, let me tell you about the struggles,
Yes.
right, first. Because very often what you preach in education when you are in the outside world and what you practice at home when you are a parent, when the stakes are high, I'm ashamed to say sometimes there is a mismatch, right?
Right.
When it comes to your own kids, I do sometimes go to extremes that I would not go when I would talk about these things or create things, and that makes me more conscious, right?
Yeah.
In both ways, right?
I guess it sort of informs both the sides, right?
Both the sides,
Yes.
right? How do I, it's in education when you're working in the space, there are certain accepted theories of child development, right? How do children develop and how do children grow both, intellectually as human beings, in their hearts and bodies. There's a
Yes.
lot of knowledge around that. But one of the things about being in education is that it is also an evolving science, right?
True.
What I knew about education or what I believed was true about education, even as late as, let's say, 7-8 years back, the field changes, right?
What has changed? What are some of the key things that have changed from your vantage point?
So I think there have been many changes, and one is that from the time I was growing up in India and what seemed to be the default of education in India, which is largely that the entire system, especially in our country, is focused on what Professor Karthik Muralidharan calls a filtration system.
Which is just like sort of elimination?
It's just an elimination, is a
Yeah.
sorting mechanism, right?
Right.
Because and there is a reason for that. There are very few seats in higher education. There are very few seats going around in job oriented places, so on and so forth. And there's a large number of students vying for that kind of position. So our whole system is geared around how do you get to the top of that pile?
Yeah, top of the pyramid.
Top of the pyramid, right?
Yep.
So I think a lot of the default in the education system is around test preparation.
Yep.
So how do you do well in
And
those?
that starts very early. Yeah.
That starts very, very early. And, when I was an entrepreneur and working as part of a startup led by some of the friends that I worked with, it was a very interesting journey that I had. I met my classmate Ashish Rajpal at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, a very, very inspiring entrepreneur
Right.
who founded this organization called Exceed. Ended up working with him and a bunch of other colleagues for close to 2 decades. One of our biggest learning was that learning by rote is such an entrenched behavior, right?
Right.
In the education system.
In our country.
In our country,
Yes.
I think that default of getting children to memorize things in the textbooks and regurgitate it in the examinations, so on and so forth, without deeper learning, without understanding, without application, without ability to assimilate that knowledge in a meaningful way. I think you learn definitions of lots of things like we did, right? We learn the definition of buoyancy, we learn the definition of surface area, so on and so forth. But what do those things actually mean?
Yeah. And why are they important?
Why are they important? Where do you going to use them?
So back to our conversation on changes in the education system, right? While you have studied education, but it's also an evolving science, evolving field. What have you seen fundamentally shifting in our Indian education system, for both good and bad?
That's a very hard question. It's an important question.
Yeah.
I think about it a lot. I think it's important to understand what does the Indian education system actually look like, right?
Yeah.
India has 250 million children going to school. And that number is actually staggering.
Staggering, yeah.
And if you look at India, just like Kishore Biani said, there is India 1, there is India 2, and there is India 3. I think the education system is also highly stratified. I think when people like you and I talk about education, I think our reference is, let's say, about 40 million households, about 100 million people, largely in India 1, who are educated like us, know English, have access to higher education, all of that, right? So that's when...
That's literally like 4 crores.
Just,
right?
Just 100 million people, right?
10 crores, yeah.
Or even less if you look at people who have accessed some high quality higher education, so on and so forth, right?
Yeah.
So it's a very small sliver of India. I think that's something that I learned very early on in my journey in education.
Yeah.
That children who go to private schools, like the elite private schools, the way our children go to, so on and so forth. I think that's very important to understand that. And the comparator of those people is the world, right? In a sense, when we say Indians are doing very well in America, there are so many CEOs coming out of India, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
We're really referring to a very small sliver of our population. So that's very important for us to understand and appreciate.
Yeah.
A vast majority of Indian children are going to government schools or affordable private schools. Over the last several decades, I think a couple of good things have happened. One is perhaps in the 80s, when we were going to school, access to education was a big problem. Not all children in India could access schools. But I think the incredible expansion of public education system that has happened over the last several decades has now brought schools closer to children.
Right.
So the enrollment rates of children have really gone up. But what has not kept in pace is the quality of learning outcomes.
Right.
If you look at all kinds of assessment data coming out of India, one of them is highly cited. It is called the ASER report, the Annual Status of Education report, which is created by a very famous non-profit called Pratham. It's published every year. The results are very, very depressing. One is that even on basic floor level skills, whether it is basic reading a paragraph in their own language or doing basic math, many children in India are lagging behind, almost 2 grades behind, if not more sometimes. So this crisis of foundational learning is a very, very important challenge for India. So while one part of India is racing ahead, getting away from the norm, another part of India is really struggling. So that's a very important reminder of the challenge we face of education in India.
I think we're talking about some of the even more fundamental tenets of what we call as right education, right? You're talking about the filtering mechanism, right?
Yes.
As a mental model, Indian education system is designed to filter, right?
Yes.
And what is the price of that? Like, can you share that for?
So
for
the
our
price
audience?
of that is what it's Professor Karthik Muralidharan calls that the filtration system.
Yes.
And it's visible everywhere, right? If you look at and here's a sort of a anecdotal way to understand it, that society pays for the same service 4 times. This is kind of my hypothesis. I have not yet gotten around to proving it. So we all pay taxes as citizens. Those taxes are supposed to pay for high quality public education for our young children.
Right.
Oftentimes that when children go to government schools, they find that they're not exiting with the right set of skills, so on and so forth. So parents, in the hope of better education, are taking children away from government schools and putting them in what are affordable budget private schools.
Right.
These are not the elite private schools. 4 in 10 children go there. But even then, the educational outcomes are not that much better in affordable private schools. So what does the parent then do? They put their children in tutoring centers, right?
Yeah,
so
as a third intervention.
As a third intervention.
Yeah.
So you've paid for the same intervention and again. Then when children reach, let's say, grade 10 or grade 12, and you think that children would graduate and go into higher education, you find there is intense competition for those seats.
Sure.
And just studying the school curriculum well is not going to get into the competitive space. So that's how you have this entire coaching industry taken over. So
coaching industrial complex
taken over. There are lots of stories about that. There's a very interesting book, Subasis, if you haven't read it. It's recently published by a young scholar named Vishal Vasantakumar. It's called The Smart and the Dumb. And it's about the politics of education. Very well written book. I met Vishal recently, and it
speaks to this.
It speaks to this and many other challenges facing education in India. But it has a very interesting chapter on quota, which is this place,
the infamous quota.
And all of that. So you've ended up, but there's, in fact, I correct myself. You've now paid for what, 4 times for the same service, but I think you'll pay for a 5th time. And here is the catch, that these children, let's say they made it after all this coaching and everything to the IITs or the NITs or to the good medical colleges, so on and so forth. But let's say talk about the engineering colleges, right? many of them get to that final year like we all did. And if you remember, there was intense stress during the fourth year because we didn't have the soft skills
Correct.
to get the jobs. We didn't know how to communicate, we didn't know how to present
interview,
ourselves, and so on and so forth. So you have another set of these skilling institutes and
Products.
almost finishing school, so to say. So you start with an education system which needs reinforcement at every stage, and that's a big challenge.
Yeah. Now, thanks for sharing. I mean, it's staggering. My mind's just, it's pretty overwhelming, honestly, to see the various layers of interventions. Now, just flipping the lens to a parent, right, to a dad or a mom. I know we can't solve for curing this, the system of its, whatever it's struggling with. But as a dad, what are the couple of things that you would do in order to not substitute all of that, but how do you really make sure that your children are really getting their education for the sake of why we need to get educated in the first place? And how do parents play a role at home outside of school in order to create that holistic growth for the children, which ultimately we all know that it's all about how you learn, what you learn, and it's a lifelong journey. Like, how do you set yourself for that as a dad and mom?
I think both
Does
are
that make
very
sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. I think the second question is harder.
Yeah.
Not to say that the first question is easier, but let me address them to the extent I know about or I can think of. I think the first one is that as parents, I think we know we are overwhelmed by the sheer intensity of struggles that children face, right? On one hand, it is the academic competition which we just spoke about.
Yep.
The other one that children are facing, not just only because of academic competition, but also there is this entire crisis of adolescent mental health, which is being talked about a lot, right? That children at the age of between their teens and all the way into their 20s are facing a lot of mental health challenges because the world is getting tougher and tougher.
Right.
And so that's a very overwhelming world. So how do we prepare children for that world? And a lot of, at least what I would distill it is what I would call 3+2 skills. And let me tell you what I mean by 3+2, right?
Okay, yeah,
because there is this whole curriculum, like you can think of all kinds of curriculum and skills and competencies you can master. But if you distill it down to what does it take to really do well in work and in life, and what does research tell us?
Yep.
I think first, we need to give children tools to make sense of the world. So understanding is the first skill. The second is how to use that knowledge in the real world to make something useful, right?
Sure.
So application is the second
So
thing.
understanding, application.
Right?
Yep.
And the third is communicating, right? Because we live with others, right? Other people. So you can be doing great work, but how do you make sure others understand what you are trying to do? How do you get to work with them? So whether it's communication or collaboration. But the +2 is very important, right? The three, of course, the world of academics, the world of knowledge can be structured in ways and means to get children ways to understand things. So they need to get away from rote learning. They need to really understand a few things and build that deeper knowledge. I think we can give children a lot more opportunities to apply that knowledge in either projects or work products so that they know that it is useful.
Sure.
And of course, there's lots more opportunities that we can give children to communicate in speech, in writing, so on and so forth. But I think the +2 is very, very important, and I want to come back to that. The one is understanding oneself. I think if you look at all the teachings of all the great sages, educational philosophers, whether it is Krishnamurti or Aurobindo, I think a lot of emphasis on that is around how
Self-awareness.
self-awareness, but also self-regulation, right? If you've heard of all the work now going on in socio-emotional learning, they talk a lot about a function of the brain
Yeah,
called
emotional
the
intelligence, all the work that's
yeah,
around,
but
yeah.
within that executive function, executive
Yes.
function is really that break in the brain, our system, because we as human beings are always trained to go for the low hanging fruits, right?
Right.
So should I have this huge jar of sweets
Yeah.
that's in
Should I
front
just go
of
for the
me?
sugar?
Yes, yes.
Straight up.
Yeah, so I think if you look at all kinds of studies, this delayed gratification is a very, very hard skill. And therein lies this self awareness and self regulation. If that is instilled in children and in young people early, because most things in life, unfortunately, are going to be really difficult.
That's right.
Right?
And all the good things, right, that is worth something will not happen overnight.
It's all not
takes a
work.
long time.
It takes a long time. So how do you delay that gratification? I think is a very, very important skill. And the other corollary skills, one is knowing myself, the other is knowing others.
Yes.
Right? How do we make sense of other people? How do we understand other people? How do we empathize with them? How do we understand what they're thinking and feeling, especially in a world which is increasingly becoming far more polarized,
Right.
and also diverse, right? We grew up in a world where most people were like ourselves, right? You and I
Yeah.
come from the same state. We would speak the same language, share many of the same customs, so on and so forth.
It's fascinating you say that, right? Like there's an irony to that, an interesting contradiction, right, between the past and the present. It was less diverse, right, but we were less polarized. Whereas now we are more diverse, but we're more polarized. That makes sense?
Yes, except that in the past perhaps we were polarized, but because media and communication
really fuel
platforms
the
were not
polarization.
there,
Right.
that polarization perhaps was not as evident as it is now.
It didn't have that bite that it has now.
It didn't have this bite it has now, and didn't
Yeah.
also have this spread it has right now.
That's correct.
So if you get angry with someone, if I get angry with you
You can
today
make a
over
million
here,
people angry about the same thing.
I can make a million people angry about the same thing by broadcasting my anger. I
Right.
think that opportunity for mass destruction
Right.
of emotions is much more available now.
So now, yeah, coming back to your point of knowing others in this polarized world, right, for children, understanding others. That was your.
Yeah, and I think that's a very, very big thing, because a lot of times, and sometimes the others mean people with different mindsets, with different cultures, with different ways of looking and thinking about the world. How do you get children to understand that my way is not the only way, right?
Yeah.
Or things I like may not be things that other people like. I think that's something that I often have to make an effort with my own children, right? To get them to see other ways of being and living. And
How do you do that? Like, can you share some stories?
I think a part of it is I have come to realize that increasingly as our own privilege has grown, we also live in bubbles, right?
That's right.
We lived in gated communities. We live in spaces which may look diverse in one way, but are actually not that
Pretty
diverse.
homogeneous.
Pretty homogeneous, right?
Yeah.
So I think travel is a very big leveler, right? And that's something I experienced early on, right?
Right. We talked about that. Yeah.
Yeah, and to speak to people who not like yourself, right? I think giving children an opportunity to meet young people outside of their just background, throw them into these situations where they are with other younger people or other adults. And oftentimes I see when they go to spaces which are different, they come back with very different experiences. My son just attended a summer camp at a university, and he was away for a week, and I could see that he came back with things which was not just the knowledge that he gained, but also perspectives which were
Yes.
very different. And I think when children come back with this kind of realization, earlier I used to do this, and now I used to do
Right.
this, I think that's when you can see things
Right.
changing.
I love this framework, the 3+2. It's so simple. And I think that's a great takeaway from this. I mean, I'm just going to summarize it for my own self. So 3 is understand, apply, and communicate.
engage.
And 2 is understand yourself and understand others. That's powerful. Wow, that's pretty impressive. Thanks for sharing.
And I didn't make it up. I
I
mean,
know.
it's pretty well documented in pretty much everything that you see in the literature out there.
Yeah.
Whether it is talking about what does it mean to learn, what does it mean to perform well in the world of work, but
Yeah.
what it also means to perform as a human being, because now as our lifespans are growing, I think we need to take more care about ourselves
Yes.
to see how we can lead healthier and better lives.
Yeah. This is fascinating. I mean, there's so many questions that are coming to my mind. One of the things that's really playing in my own head as a dad is independence, right, of children. I mean, amidst all of this, right, there's a constant struggle of how much to, and I know your kids are a little bit older than mine. Mine are 12 and 10. And, you always have this temptation to just do things for them. I mean, they're pretty protected compared to how we were growing up. So how do you first practice letting go of your own temptation to do things for them, and how do you expose them to the real world? Like you said, you came back to Bhubaneswar, Unit 1 school. You got exposed to the real world out there, right? Is there an equivalent of that for your children that you are consciously doing, or you could think of doing? Does that make sense?
Yeah. And both of my children have had their share of struggles, right? And Advait, particularly my son, when he was in middle school, had a big challenge when he was diagnosed with dysgraphia. He had a challenge with writing.
Oh, okay.
Here is a boy who can speak very well. He can communicate very well. But when it came to writing, it was a real challenge for.
And it got discovered in middle school.
It got discovered, I think, early on in primary school, but I think I'm guilty that I didn't take strong action on it, in spite of the fact that I come from this field and all of that. I thought it will kind of go away on its own, or it's just something which is a slight delay
Sure.
in development because children function. But around middle school, we found that he was really struggling. Right? And a lot of it was putting thoughts on paper, attending to how he structures his writing, so on and so forth. And it came to a point where he once came back and told me, and that was the turning point for me. We were talking about something, and I said, why can't you do this or that? And he said, Baba, I'm just an average person.
Oh.
And it struck me that here's a child who's certainly not average by any stretch of imagination. For every parent, their child is not an average.
Right.
But here's also a child who can do other things. So I think to me that was...
How old was he?
I think he must have been in grade 5 or 6, maybe, or maybe a little older. I don't remember. Maybe certainly in middle school. It was not primary school. It was certainly in middle school. And so I was, I was in all sorts of emotions. That of course, a lot of it was initially guilt. That here's me who's supposedly going and working in education, and especially in the work that I do now is in early literacy and numeracy, and here's this fundamental thing my child is struggling with, and I didn't know how to address it, or I hadn't taken enough steps to address it. Then I think it took me a while to confront myself that what should I and we together as parents should do about it, and what should he do about it as well, right? So we started having conversations, of course, with some experts and other things, but we started having conversations with him that it is not something which is debilitating, right? You're not going to, this is not the end of the world,
Sure.
right? At the same time, it is also something which needs improvement.
Addressing, yeah.
It is important that it needs improvement. And I had to teach myself about writing, actually. There's a lot of literature on reading and literacy. When you talk about literacy instruction, you've
Right.
been in the US, I think there's a lot of focus on reading.
Yep.
But writing is actually understudied.
That's true. That's true.
And
I didn't think about that.
when I started reading and researching, I found out there is so much research on writing, and there was an interesting book I read called The Writing Revolution, so writing is something that just doesn't develop on its own,
yeah.
right? Just like reading, it has to be explicitly taught. Also, writing is a very complex skill because you
Yes.
need to read and understand. You need to form letters. You need to associate shapes at a very basic level. Then you need to construct words, sentences, paragraphs, and you need to bring ideas. So it became an interesting sort of journey that Advait took, and all credit to him. I think he approached it with a degree of confidence, which I think most young people wouldn't have. But what it taught me is that there has to be, and something that I had learned in education is something called the gradual release of responsibility. Basically, that when you want to learn a new skill, they say first I do, which means the adult does it to
Right.
show or demonstrate, then we do it together, and then you
And
do.
then you do. Yep.
And
Yes,
I think
I equate that to learning in a driving school, right?
driving school, right?
Yeah, it's a great analogy.
Right, great
Yeah.
analogy. First, your instructor sits with you.
Yeah.
Now, all those things are easy, like you said. I think you asked me earlier that how did my... So sometimes we do that with teachers, and we write curriculum around that. But it's so hard to practice it yourself.
As a parent, yeah.
As a parent, right? There is so much letting go of control I would do.
Yeah.
So when I was working with him initially, there's so many challenges he faced. But I think together we took that journey, right? We
Right.
decided to work with him, and his teachers. Then we moved him to a different school. His teacher was incredibly supportive. His English
That's
teacher was
wonderful.
incredibly supportive. And he had another writing teacher, Swati, who also believed in him. And he actually ended up publishing a story. Here is a child who is struggling
with
to writing, in composing,
Yeah.
framing things, but has incredible ideas. And when you find the right channel, when you find the right structure, when you give a little bit of guidance, coaching, and also some belief, right? I think the choice we need to exercise as adults is that we need to have a belief in the end goal and destination, and cultivate that belief that you can do it. But at the same time, it is you who will do it.
Yeah.
I think that messaging oftentimes doesn't come across. I'm not going to be writing for you. I'm not going to be sitting in your examinations,
Yeah.
or I'm not going to be typing out an email. You're going to do it, but I'm there around you.
Yeah.
Should you need any help? It was not easy. It was initially either I would overcorrect or just let him be, and
Right.
and then I think over a period of time he got over a lot of it.
That's a great story. Thanks for sharing. And he's doing well now on his
Yeah,
own?
he is doing
Yeah.
well now, and thankfully, touch wood. And of course, he does have his struggles. It doesn't
Sure.
come naturally to him. But I think what he's now clear about is this self-belief that I'm not a bad writer. I have writing challenges,
Right.
right?
That's a great way to frame it, actually. I mean, a lot of times it's like saying I'm a bad person or I made a bad choice, right? There's a fundamental difference between these two narratives. It's the same thing, that I'm not a bad writer, I had some challenges. That's a
And in
great way to
fact,
frame
if
it.
anything, he's a great writer.
Right.
I mean, you should see some of these stories. They're incredibly funny. I wish he writes more now that he's in grade 11 and 12 and more into economics and other things. He doesn't like to write as much, creative stuff.
Yeah.
But some of these stories he has written are incredible, right? There is a story that he wrote, which I particularly thought was very impressive, was there is this, I think it's set in a kind of a military setting where there's some kind of warfare going on, and there is this person who shoots a child by mistake while trying to take out a terrorist.
Oh, wow.
And he talks about this catharsis of what this person goes through when he comes back. Sorry, I made a mistake. He's trying to save a child and
Yeah.
shoots his comrade by mistake.
Got it. Yeah. It's the other
And
one.
and then he's going to meet the family members of his comrade. And here is a child in I think he was in grade 8 or something. The fact that you could think about
Think of this,
a situation and
Yeah.
convert it into a narrative is pretty powerful.
It is.
But then you got to know the mechanics of writing
Yes.
and so on and so forth. And I think some of that could be taught.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think a lot of, I mean, me included, constantly struggling in academics. There's so much, obviously, pressure on figuring out what your kids are passionate about, right? Seeing their passion, spotting their talent, and then giving them exposure to that. I mean, it is quite overwhelming to be a dad and mom at this age. I mean, I'm sure all our dads and moms thought the same at that stage. It's no different, and I know that there's no magic bullet, there's no silver bullet to that. But this, I'm a bit curious to understand, how do you, and your wife's name is Sony, how do you grapple with this? How have you grappled with this topic of what are they great at, what are they passionate about, and what should they be focusing so that they can turn out to be people who can take care of themselves. There are too many things to handle.
Yeah, I think this is a difficult question and it is very much work in progress.
It is,
and
yeah.
we keep learning every day. I think it's a little bit of both. I think it's that ikigai thing, right?
Right, yeah.
What you want to do, what you're interested in, what you're good at, and what
What'll make you money?
or what is valuable to the world, right?
Right, what's
Whether it is
valuable to
to
the world, correct, yeah.
And that's often a hard thing for children to first find was one, because I think my children are going through a stage, they constantly either getting too excited about something.
Yeah.
So I think one day Srishti wants to be a biologist or a biotechnologist and wants to invent some new drug, and the other day she says, I don't know what I'm going to do.
Right.
To Advait, who now says, I want to do something in economics or business, or I want to be a soldier on the other day. So things keep changing on a weekly basis. So
I hear
they're
you.
at that stage. So that's one. I think
My son, by the way, is swinging between being a big truck driver, because he has this fascination to big trucks. That'll be cool to be a driver of that, to being a sports analyst. So that's what we're dealing with these days.
So I think on good days they're super clear, on not so good days they're completely unclear.
Right.
I think the best way is something that someone told me, that keep trying, right? Keep trying, and it's like throwing darts.
That's right.
And something will stick. And one of the things I have begun to realize with a great deal of humility is that parents only make so much difference, yourself directly.
Right.
So a lot of what I'm seeing, especially now in children, is that they're learning a lot more from their peers. They're more influenced by their peers. They're more influenced by other adults, right? Other than your parents,
yeah.
and or teachers that much. So I think how can we as parents increase the probability of those fruitful interactions from happening, right?
Yeah.
I think that's where I think the best we can do.
Yeah.
Is there a experience that they can have? My whether it's this gymnastics that Srishti is so excited about. I think that experience has made her a lot about what she is,
Yeah.
and or whether it is interacting with some adults. I mean, my son Advait has this a couple of amazing teachers who've developed his interest in economics.
Right.
And these are teachers who are not traditional teachers in the sense that these are people who led some other career and then suddenly became interested in the subject, and I think he's learned a lot from them.
Yeah.
He is trying out some projects with his friend. Of course, the project keeps changing, but he has some kind of a business he wants to learn with clothing for teenagers on good days.
Right.
I think the business is doing very well. On bad days, they don't want, they're getting no orders. But things like that, I think if we can get them into situations where they're more likely
Yeah.
to do things which might be leading them in the
Yeah, we
direction,
spark something in them.
spark something in them is
Yeah.
kind of the best we can do.
Yeah.
Of course, there is the other thing is, I think just to be the kind of people, or not kind of people, but at least demonstrate some behaviors that
Sure.
you think. So showing is better than telling.
Yeah.
I think children observe us quite keenly, more
Yeah,
than
more
we
keenly than you
we think
think they are. Yeah.
Yes, so my children constantly tell me how I speak, how I behave, and,
That's right.
And all of those things. So they're very keen observers.
Yeah, I mean, that's again, I'm struggling with these questions more so now as I'm looking. My son's going to become a teenager now, and he's coming on his own, and I'm in that transition phase of moving away from a little bit more instructive to being more like a friend now. Respecting his opinions, allowing him to do stuff, but it's not easy. Well, Anustup, we've covered a lot of ground in the last almost more than an hour now.
Yeah.
There's so much to talk about, of course. I'm pretty sure I'm going to bug you again in the next few weeks to pull you back from your busy schedule and have one more conversation, maybe many more. But to wind down today's conversation, I have a couple more questions to go. One is, what are your thoughts about being a dad now as your kids are entering this new phase, right? Advait is 16, Srishti is 14, correct? Did I get that right? What are you thinking about of your role as a dad over the next few years?
Hard question again. I think it's that phase of their time when I think parents are a little more on the periphery of their existence.
Right.
But we have not completely kind of gone away, right? We still need to play their role.
Yeah.
It may not be as intensive. But I think, as I see, is more of a person you can reach out to when you need. And I just want to make sure the communication channels are open. Because this is the time when things do happen to them where they would need someone to talk to, they would need someone to bounce off to. Right now, they're not looking for someone to supervise them, they're not looking for someone to manage them. Of course, some parts I do feel that do need supervision or some parental management, and we don't shy away from doing that. There are certain things young people need to know to be able to be successful, right? There is some degree of discipline, some degree of intensity that is required to carry things through, so on and so forth. Or there are some guardrails that need to be there around what are some of the good choices you can make. But over a period of time, I think what tends to happen, from whatever I have heard of people who are a little bit ahead of me in the game or in the journey, is that this communication channel becomes very, very critical, because the communication channel slowly closed
Sort
down,
of
wither away.
Yeah.
I can see already
Yeah.
them spending more time behind closed doors than we would like them to.
Right.
But I also see that as a reflection of their seeking independence, them seeking more control over their lives. But sometimes they do need an opportunity to talk about things, right?
Yeah.
About their friends, their relationships, things that they're concerned about, things that they're afraid of. Those things actually don't go away.
Right. I mean, we're struggling with them even now as
Yeah,
us.
yeah, as
Yeah.
us, right? I mean, that was such a nice thing when you and I went on that walk.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
do need sometimes
That's right.
friends to talk to who are not in my life every day.
Yeah.
So how do I create that space where they can then reach out when they need? I think that's going to be an important challenge going forward for me as a parent, and us as both of us as parents.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. Yeah, and I think that, that again, I'm thinking that comes from a strong bond, right? And them looking at you as a safe space and then you talked about observing without judgment, right? A lot of our, temptations is to from our own biases and our life experiences and to be protective as particularly dads, as men, right? We might be judging a little bit, like what could be happening in their life, where, how do I keep this little child safe? But they're looking at you as observers or as friends or another human being who can listen to them without judgment.
Right.
Right? It's hard. It's really hard.
And it's not like that they don't need direction. I
Right.
think there is a fair bit of
True.
structure and guidance and some degree of direction and control that people need, because the other extreme where parents are so detached from their children and a very laissez-faire could be also very, very dangerous.
True.
So I do struggle with that. I mean, if you are struggling in math, you got to put in those hours. Or if you if you want to finish a project, then there is a certain definition of what good should look like, right?
Yeah.
Or so on and so forth, right?
Yeah.
I think that is one. The second is the balance of what kind of message you're sending them right now when they struggle.
Yep.
And that's a very tough one, right? I do call my children like all dads after they finish the examination, but I do watch myself when they've said that I didn't do that well.
Yes.
What is it that I tell them?
What's your reaction?
What's my reaction? What do I think in my mind? But what do I tell? I'm more conscious of that right now.
I'm curious. How do you react?
So,
or respond rather,
yeah,
not react.
Yeah. No, I am not perfect. And because they call me, because they know that, that they think I'm the study parent, right?
And how do they think of mom as?
Maybe all the good stuff, parent or. But they do have mixed views. I think Advait apparently had a essay to write about both of his parents, comparing both of his parents.
Wow.
It's
an unbelievable task, I must say.
I think he mentioned that his mom was like the sun, who was more energetic and more kind of bringing all the intensity into the home and life, and I'm the more the moon, which is less intense and maybe a little bit far off and shows up in the night, partly because I unfortunately that's been my biggest regret as a parent, that I don't spend enough time at home.
I know.
I travel a lot, and that's the choice I've had to make throughout my career. I'm not very proud of it as a parent, but I have this other I have so many children as well that I
I know.
do have to serve, and I think my colleagues and everyone I work with.
Yeah.
So it's a hard choice, but
Well, it's also, I know it. First of all, thanks for sharing your struggles. It's very hard. The guilt really is real, right?
yeah.
The guilt's real, but I'm sure you are. We all know that the quality of time versus the quantity is also an important one. So I'm
Sure,
pretty sure
yeah.
you make the most of the time you have with them when you are with them.
Yeah, I try to come back every weekend and spend as much time I could, and little things, right?
Yes.
Driving with them to wherever they're going, or having that small conversation
Yeah.
on the side when their doors are not locked
Or sneaking in a little bit.
sneaking in a little bit.
Yeah.
I think it's more my need to be with them versus, I don't know, their need to be with me.
Right.
But I do feel that guilt. I do remember when when Srishti was younger, we were asking them, what do you remember of your childhood? What do you remember of us? And one of these things she told me was that I remember you either packing or unpacking, going to Madurai. I used to go to Madurai quite a bit
lot,
in
right.
those days, and that had struck in my life. But yeah, I do feel sometimes that guilt, but I do try to make up in hopefully in other ways.
Yeah, I'm sure. Speaking of your other vast number of children, and speaking on behalf of the parents, what it's going to be a hard question for you. What are the top couple of things that knowing what you know of the state of our education, the state of parenting, what are just a couple of things that you would tell all the parents who are raising children at the age that you were working in, so that they feel like there is definitely a lot of hope and possibilities for their children as they're raising the children in our country?
Very, very hard question. I don't know, and I can't speak to every parent. But I think if I were to look at what's happening to children across the board,
Yeah.
I think the first thing that children of our country need is a belief in their potential. Because every child is destined to do something really, really good, and I think that belief is first and foremost very important. And when that belief
That's
comes
powerful.
across from adults, children do respond. I mean, some time ago in this podcast, I mentioned that the baseline level of children's reading and math is very concerning. But what we have also seen in the programs that we are working with, and I have worked with in my past, that when teachers and parents and the community get together, there is significant movement in that possible, even with the same resources, even with the same contextual conditions. So there is data now coming out of our work,
Sure.
which is showing a significant movement. The state of Madhya Pradesh recently released some data publicly, which shows that in 2 years there's been a pretty significant upward move in this.
And that has happened because of more involvement by the
government,
caregivers,
the government, the caregivers, stakeholders. We can do a lot more. Believe in reaching out to parents in ways and means that they can find some space and time. But yes, there is this potential. So the first message that I want every adult in this country to know is that sending this message to children that you have high potential, and therefore we want to invest in you. And I think that can come across in many different ways to children. I think the second message that adults, and when I'm saying adults, it could be teachers, parents,
Sure.
caregivers, everyone could know, is that children's development takes time, but it's like compound interest.
Right.
You do something little every day, it accumulates. So, for example, something simple like we have seen that reading to your child every day, let's say, or reading with your child every day, let's say, even for 15-20 minutes, can have a massive impact.
Right.
Or just talking to your child. This morning I was reading something which I was reminded of. One of the big drivers of children's brain development is what is called serve and return conversations with adults. It's taken
like a
from
tennis match.
tennis match,
Yeah.
right? So the child is saying something, doing something, and the adult responds to that. The adult is not giving a lecture, but the child is maybe asking a question, you give a short answer, or the child is looking for attention, you give something back. So this serve and return kind of conversations or
fascinating.
interactions between caregivers and children again can have a dramatic impact on children. So, and the exact number is not known, but one of the things that has been well researched is when children from more privileged homes come into school, they already have a couple of more million words that they have in their they have listened to and they have engaged with, versus children who come from a little less well resourced homes. And I think we need to provide parents with that support, with that encouragement, with some tools, so that there can be a little more serve and return with children. So in
Right.
summary, believe in children, engage with them.
That's beautiful and that's profound. I mean, simple, believe and engage, right? Yep, thank you. Well, it's been a really thought-provoking and stimulating conversation, Anustup. I mean, you and I have been friends for the last 25 years, but I'm seeing a new facet of you today,
Likewise.
which I really appreciate.
Likewise.
Which I
I have
absolutely
also,
appreciate.
and I also have, I'm also amazed by the work you do. I've always been very proud of your professional journey because
Sure.
you've done very well in the corporate world. And you remember, I was a struggling entrepreneur when I had come to pitch some ideas to you when you were a hotshot corporate guy in
Not
Disney
really.
or wherever you were. You went and did very well for yourself in America, then worked for corporate giants. But I think what I'm always struck by, Subhashish, is just your curiosity and your humility, which came across, and in everything that you do as a person. Because
thank you.
I guess I enjoyed that. And you still remain fit, and we used to call you Sylvester Stallone. I guess you still.
I was hoping you don't
Yes, and
bring
I
that
will
up.
take the advantage of your platform to pull your leg. But I'm genuinely very, very happy to see the work you're doing, and especially, having conversations with fathers.
Yes.
It's the parent we have forgotten with. Mothers make a huge, huge impact. But we as fathers, I think, need to make a bigger impact. And I
True.
just genuinely think, in a very quiet and unassuming way, you've been working on this. So I'm very proud and I'm very grateful.